one equation. You have employment and output in the fossil fuel section and green section, or high emission, low emission section for each country. You have similarly that effect here, but in addition, you have the effects of the, as it were, quote unquote, the rest of the world presented by a weighted index of its impacted share on the country from participating in the global economy. The weights are typically based on trade shares or on capital flows. Trade shares using more common using in both experts. These are the foreign variables. In other words, the GVAR has two sets of estimates. It has the domestic estimates, as in the Cato 2014, but it also has foreign variables, what we call star variables. Now, the interesting aspect of it is how GVAR overcomes the following problem. Think of, for example, our model is very small. I'm going to show you that we've only got five countries. But even if we assume a relatively parsimonious model with just say one leg of each variable, so the model, the equations have a limited list of variables. But if we allow for the rest of the world, that means that 5 divided by, say, you have I don't know, data for 20 countries, a huge number of estimates separately. And typically for the sample sizes that we have, that quickly runs into the problem of a poor estimation because of the massive loss in the degree of freedom. The suggestion of GVAR is to avoid erosion that efficiency by suggesting an alternative. What's that alternative? The alternative is to employ somehow the complete collective impact of the rest of the world and pack it into one variable. How is that done? That's typically done in the literature. The standard method is principal component analysis when you're working with big data. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but just to tell you that the model can be also expanded by adding a common variable, a kind of a shock that simultaneously affects all the countries. COVID-19, think of it. Earlier we talked about Ukraine, the impact of Ukraine war on world prices and oil supplies and so on, which seems to have temporarily pushed back all the concerns about green investment, because countries are desperate to secure their consumption of fossil fuel and so on. So these are the kind of variables that can be formulated in the model as a common variable. How about principal component? Well, principal component seeks to obtain the maximum variation for a large number of variables as a measure of their joint variation. So typically, the first principal component measures the largest joint variations, and as usual, they are almost certainly going to be about 50% of the joint variation. Often in empirical applications that I've seen is more than 60%. But not everything, not all the joint variations. So once the first principal component is estimated, what's left is then attempted to be captured by the first joint variation that has been excluded from the first principal component, and therefore is it's an additional variable and orthogonal to the first one, so it has no connection, no collinearity, as it were, to the first one. And the same one if there is any remaining variations in the third principal component. also be orthogonal to the first and to the second. Principal component is often employed in less so econometrics, dealing with big data, and studies show that often the first few principal components, often just the very first one, can capture a good share of the joint variations for a large amount of related variables. For an evidence, for example, see Stock and Watson paper that they have a couple of papers. This is just one of them. So citing here. I think this one suggests that just the first principal component is sufficient. So GR can then model country-specific interactive effects of a global emission by a few domestic variables. In addition, the effect of the rest of the world effects as if by star variables that take the macroeconomic modeling of CO2 emission and therefore address the interactive world effects on each country. It's an appropriate measure to employ, appropriate approach to employ when modeling a broad region of the country. Often, you know, but we work with the students who sort of say, Professor, very interested in working on Sub-Saharan Africa or European Union, Latin America, or Middle East. And in the context of the climate economics, the global climate change. GRs typically are applied based on a relatively large cross-sectional units and countries and relatively large time series. However, the number of country-specific variables are small, as for example with the model number 1 that we looked up, and are divided into domestic variables and the rest of the world or foreign variables that condition the domestic variables. Okay, so including the star variables actually affect the magnitude of the impact of the domestic variables that you obtain in the model number 1. It conditions them. GVAR was introduced in Pesseran in 2004 to estimate the world economic impact of the Asian financial crisis of 1997 and offers a solution to modeling the interdependence of variables across n countries, requiring estimating a large number of coefficients without, however, eroding estimation efficiency by relying on the generations of star variables through, for example, principal component, a number of orthogonal principal component variables. However, the method still faces an identification problem, because once you combine all the other variables that affect the output, then the estimates you obtain for the star variable is kind of like meaningless, because it doesn't really allow you to identify the estimation, the impact of each of those variables on the on your model. This problem, however, can be sidestepped if the interest in obtaining coefficient is not in obtaining coefficient estimate of the marginal effect of each regression, but in forecasting or impulse response function, because you can then just obtain the collective shock that each of the 4 equations received from the world economy without the need to estimate the make inferences about each of those individual variables which affect the outcome. So identification is not required for implementation of such task if the task is limited to impulse response function, which explains why the GVAR model, if you look at some of the implications, it usually employs for forecasting or impulse response analysis rather than inference estimation. Although it is possible to also apply GVAR to inference estimation, somewhat more complicated, but you have to rely more heavily on the more traditional semi-parametric analysis. You know, some of you are familiar from my classes. That's a topic we've covered at some length. But
Professor.
the point is that this is the...
Hello, Professor.
Sorry?
We have 5 more minutes.
4 minutes, okay.
5.
So this is the model we've got. I've expanded it a little bit. So we've got, we have the star variables, we have the autoregressive variables. In addition, also made it a multivariant by allowing the employment and output in both equations. So these are some examples of application of the model for fiscal policy and for environmental shock. I think El Nino is the topic of that in El Nino. But as far as I'm aware, it's not really been discussed in the context that we are talking about, more broad macroeconomic modeling. Our data comes from, for the European Union employment and output claims data. And it covers these countries, of which 4 we have either missing or incomplete data, so we end up with only 5: Germany, France, Hungary, Japan, and Sweden. The data covers 1994 to 2018, and our trade share for the rest of the world comes from the World Bank data for trade shares. And we have identical rows for each country for high and low, because there is only one trade share per each country. We divide them into 2 to make sure that they sum up to 1. This is the lag structure. Data shows the lag structure. Table 2 that I'm going to show you in a minute shows the table estimations that you obtain from for employment and output autoregressive models. We note that unlike number 1, the lag structure can actually differ between different countries, because the lag structure is used by the model selection kind of information criteria. AQI is the one that is commonly used in GVAR. So you have, you know, 1 lag for France, but for example for Sweden, and for Germany, for Hungary, we have 2 lags. And also more flexible in that even within each country, the lag structure could differ. For example, for Germany, on the high emission and low emission, the lag structure are different. So the table shows the estimate for the 5 countries in the sample. And these are the values here. I warn you not to attach too much importance to the particular values here. I must say that we've had some problem regarding understanding some issues about the data and arranging for them. We ran out of time. So the simplest way was just to show you how the model is implemented by using the data as it is in levels. So the coefficient values look a little bit strange, but note a number of things. The larger values comes in the rest of the world, and especially for the gross output equation here, much larger than elsewhere. And also, most of it tend to be in the high growth rather than the high emission rather than the low emission industries. These are just some general comments until we manage to sort out the proper underlying, clean up the data. But the star coefficients are far larger than the autoregressive coefficients. The rest of the world, the impact is obviously, at least here, appears to be important. There's one exception here, Sweden, when the rest of you get a big coefficient for the autoregressive one, but elsewhere that's not a characteristic at all of the table. And finally, I end up by warning to due to the limitation of data quality and sample size, the estimates are solely intended here as illustration of the steps involved in the application of G-bar. So, the values should be taken with a pinch of salt, but even if you're solely interested in impulse response function, you still have to go to this critical step, especially estimation of the star variables. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's time for us to take one or two questions. If you have any questions, let us know. Question, no, I only want to congratulate you. That solves the problem that we take.
I've heard some of you kind of speaking from the room. I have difficulty yet. If I can't hear you properly, then please write to me and then here in the chat.
Hear me? Oh yeah, maybe I speak here. Yeah, can you understand?
Yeah.
You're very good. No, I just said it's an important point that we have when we did this study. Let's say you have 4 or 5 countries and you do some interaction between the variables there, so employment, high, low intensive sector and CO2 emission. But you take them separately for each country. The issue is problem, but there is some joint driver of all the problems, that's the CO2 emission. So how you deal with these exogenous driver there, and that he doing this with a GVAR. So that's a nice, I think, addition what was done in earlier times. And the only question is what variables are stationary and what variables non-stationary? Because, for example, CO2 emission and the disasters that come from this are non-stationary because they're growing all the time. Is this then, well, for a certain shorter time period, you probably can take this as the exogenous driver for all the different countries, but for a longer time period, it may need some more consideration there, what the effect will be for a longer time period. You have the same problem with economic predictions. If you have stationary variables, you can predict well the next time periods. But if you have a non-stationary variable in it that you try to predict over time, you're more out and out of away from your predictions because of the non-stationary variable. So that's one of the interesting issues that could be raised in this context. But otherwise, with the GVAR, I think that comes from Peseran. That's a great, great invention.
Yeah. Well, what I can say about your concern is that they actually test that assumption, and from the evidence that I've seen, it's not rejected. Often is not rejected. So the proper step involved prior to the application is to test that assumption to see if the assumption holds.
Good.
That's one. So the other thing that there's also a related issue of a common variable which simultaneously affects all the the global economy, as it were, or at least the global economy in your samples. That also kind of partly takes care of the issue that you're raising, but regarding weak exogeneity, they actually test that assumption. It's a part of the many tests that you're supposed to carry out to make sure that the model is a valid one.
All right, thank you once again.
Okay, thank you.
Eben, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. This is very abstract, and I want to understand, especially following Vili's comment about the scale of the drivers of CO2 emissions. I mean, Sweden's emissions is nowhere on the scale of U.S. emissions. U.S. emissions are twice basically that of China, you know, and so it seems to me, if I'm following this right, that the concern you pointed to is to try and, I guess, get recommendations or convince emitters to reduce their emissions while still maintaining a certain level of employment. So I guess my question is, what is the best case scenario of this work that you're doing? Is it advocacy? Are you going to be using these abstractions to convince the United States policymakers to now reduce emissions when all of the other information they have has not been effective in this way? I guess I'm not exactly sure what you see as the best case scenario for any of this.
First of all, before you can convince someone or you know, be able to convince them, you got to make sure that you can convince yourself, as it were. You know, so first of all, you got to. I mean, that was the essence of that. You could then, you know, how can we go improving beyond the models we've got in order to make sure that, you know, we know some of these effects are missing from the model. How can we incorporate them? For you to be able to go to a policymaker and say, you know, this evidence I've got, are you convinced? You've got to make sure that, you know, you address A, B, C, and D. So that's the major, you know, if you like, as I said, you're modeling it. You know, how can we model this rather as Semler pointed out, more complicated effect and try and isolate the impact of different, you know, the different forces. So that's really the aim of the. But once that's done, and you could address some of the more pressing issues. For example, typically the evidence for taxation, for emission reducing taxation, is kind of weak, and is weak because they say there are political limits to how much taxation can be imposed in order to achieve the sort of long-term gain for climate stability that we need. And you could think of an alternative policies of implementing that. We kind of hopefully try to do that in our modeling by, say, also adding the incentive for green bonds return. But it's also possible to go beyond the existing, through this model, beyond the existing estimation of the taxation or, you know, call it the climate stabilizing taxation by doing something like the following. Typically, we look at it like we obtain the impulse response function, then we say, okay, what would be the impact of, say, $1 of taxation in all these countries? That's kind of like assumes that we have a uniform kind of consensus among different countries. You know, Sweden and America are two very different countries when it comes to attitude to taxation. And it would be nice to kind of like see what comes out of the model if you allow for that impact to vary across different countries. Those who are kind of like really more willing to bear higher, their citizens are more willing to bear higher taxation for the sake of climate, and those who are less so. So we could address some of these problems as well down the line to see, okay, what if we allow the impact to actually, does that make the global overall effect weaker or stronger? We don't really know that yet.
Can I ask a follow-up question then? So we know, you mentioned Germany with its energy Wende, its series of policies in the late 90s that have given it put it in a better position in terms of efficiency and emissions than the United States has. That's 30 years ago that those policies started taking place. The IPCC gives us a pretty dire predictions with a 30-year timeline. We're on the well above 2 degrees C track, closer to the 4-degree track right now. And I guess we'll come back to this question of the real economy. You mentioned taxes and trying to convince people about taxes to fund things when we could, of course, deficit spend to do what is needed. It's just a matter of political will. We don't need to ask rich people to fund this because we know rich people aren't going to fund this. So I guess my question is, again, how do these models play into what ends up being language-based arguments, natural language-based arguments on the need to do what needs to be done? I guess I'm just trying to understand how these abstractions play into who you're trying to convince and how effective that would be in convincing them to do the things that absolutely need to be done. And when we're pressed, we're going to lose everything if we don't do these. I guess I'm not quite sure. I'm not reconciling the two.
I mean, again, I am, the presentation here is not, obviously the aim of it ultimately is to produce values which could address some of these problems, but that wasn't the topic of my talk, which was much, much narrower. I just wanted to say that, to show that there are models which could actually take the impact of the rest of the world into the estimation of the impact of, that, of course, partly answers your question. If these rest of the world effects are taken into account, does the outlook look worse or better? I mean, certainly that's relevant. Does it make the task more urgent, or have we found something which actually works and we could rely on more perhaps extensively? But yeah, I mean, there is going to be differences across different countries, and it's important once the model is in place to take those differences into account to see whether the overall impact on the global aspect of the economy is driven further down or more advanced. And of course, there's going to be, Germany, I agree with you. Germany is for climate, is way ahead of other European countries. They had a Green Party, 30 years ago in Parliament, and they, of course, influence policies and so on. Sweden, again, is a very, very high tax country. And the United States is a country where not long ago, if you might remember, someone actually got into an airplane and went into the building in Washington, the tax building, in protest to paying taxes. They think, there are many in America who think that taxation is kind of like a robbery, that they're taking the part of what it belongs to them. So different countries have different attitudes. That puts political limits on the politicians, how far they're willing to push for that. And it would be nice to see the impact of these differences in different countries to attitude to taxation and so on, how that would impact the overall effect. It's all very well to say that we're interested in assessing the impact of, say, carbon taxation or green bonds on all countries and come up with a value.
For the sake
But
of time, we have to
make it
move
more
to-
realistic by taking these differences.
Hello?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we have to move on to the next person. Oriol, please.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Hi. Okay. Yeah. Perfect. So, and perfect. I don't know. Yeah, I guess that I have to be. Okay, sorry, it's a bit weird. Thank you so much, Willie, for inviting me to the research workshop on climate change. Thank you, Nick and Samuel, for organizing it. It's like a pleasure to be back here at the New School to present my work. So, as they have like 25 minutes from now on. Okay, so that should be like 3:50. No, like 4. So like what I'm going to present, I mean, like I know that it would be like a bit late right now when I would be presenting, so I assume that people would be a bit tired right in the afternoon. So I decided to start with a kind of tongue-in-cheek dark humor. But like a Utah professor was wondering, like whether, like you have now we have the COP28 conference like in Dubai right now, where all the politicians are meeting through private jets. And like there was this Utah professor who was wondering, maybe like our climate accords that are driving actually carbon emissions, like maybe we have, this is evidence of anthropogenic climate induced like climate change, because every time that you have a climate conference, emissions increase. So then it's like, what is the problem then? Yeah, of course. I mean, like, maybe not causation, but in fact, I mean, I would suggest at least, or like that's a bit like the idea of the paper, that maybe like the policies that are being discussed there like are not ambitious enough, and maybe we need some way to agree like whatever is being decided there is not ambitious enough, and we need really like vigorous investment. We need vigorous green bonds. We need a lot of action in order to solve what is a war on climate change. And like my question then was, in these times, like right now, like we were discussing, like carbon pricing policies is usually always like economists agree that it's like the main policy in order to facilitate and accelerate decarbonization, but maybe we don't have enough time, as like Evan was asking before, like in a very interesting question, was that, yeah, we are already like on the Mad Max climate apocalypse scenario, like maybe we cannot like let just like market forces solve like these climate externalities. So, and also right now we are no longer in like normal times. Like right now we have a world with actual wars, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in Libya and so on. We have like trade wars between US and China, namely. We have like a lot of sanctions on like, I don't know, like Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, and so on. And like there's a real threat of the globalization. And one of my ideas or hypothesis is that we are going to have a scenario of price volatility. Like we really need not only to have decarbonization, but sometimes these carbon pricing policies can exacerbate inflationary pressures. So we need to try to have a kind of twin objective, not only decarbonize, but also stabilize prices. And in order to try to investigate these questions, I used the famous model by Professor Zemler and with his co-author, Peter Flaschel, who recently died, fortunately. on the stability of competitive economies, like and precisely like using the Bielefeld disequilibrium approach in order to create that basically it's a model, a very stylized model of multi-sector growth, but try to empirically estimate the intensity, the adjustment coefficients that govern its growth using empirical data in order to build a data-driven dynamical model that is also ecologically extended. Like the core of the Bielefeld approach uses input-output coefficients, which of technology coefficients, but right now we have a wealth of data, like input-output data that is ecologically extended. So you can have like 2,000 ecological indicators, like any kind of like greenhouse gas that you can think of, it's there, you know, or many kinds of land use, many kinds of water use, and so on. So it really like helps us understand much more, not only like how the cross-industrial growth happens, but also like the environmental impact of this multi-sector growth. And then, yeah, I investigate sector-oriented policies, and especially like right now when I was writing the paper, like there was a lot of discussion apropos the Ukraine war, about the oil embargo, and to use strategic price controls in order to prevent the price from skyrocketing. Right now, it seems that this is already the past, you know, and inflation has been finally controlled, but not as much as in Europe, I would say. And now also we have the Inflation Reduction Act that it's trying to use tax subsidy schemes in order not only to have decarbonization, but also reduce prices. And maybe by seeing how like actually you have economic growth and also low inflation in the US, maybe, yeah, it's like the path to go, you know? And the point is that, yeah, like we need more planning, you know, we need more state intervention. Like when we have like state policy, like all like laissez-faire economies are always, oh no, but you cannot pick winners and losers. But when you have climate change, you really want winners and you want losers. You know, you want like less cow-based milk, you want more electric cars, you want more solar energy and less coal, for example. You know, so it's very clear that kind of problems. Also, like more human right-led kind of economic activity, like more health, more education, I would say more transportation, housing, and so on. So just like I'm going to start with the main findings, you know, I like to explain the findings. So essentially first, the Bielefeld model framework allows us to not only understand the structure, the complex structure of the interactions in prices and quantities at the sector level, like the network structure of these interactions, but also the intensity of them, you know? So I use network analysis in order to try to have like further light on the structure of these interactions. And then also I use a Bayesian linear mixed model in order to compute the intensity of those. And like one of the main findings is that we have a very highly hierarchical economic structure that of intermediate production, which makes it very vulnerable when you have, for example, electricity. All economic activity requires electricity and energy. So if you have an input cost shock there, like for example the oil embargo, like that will really trigger like a shock in the whole of the economy. So we really like need also like sector-oriented policies in order to solve these issues. And like the question is like, what do price controls or tax subsidy mixes do? So what I find is that price controls actually, you know, the conventional wisdom always says, oh, no, you cannot have price controls because you will have scarcity. But maybe we can debate price controls in this exceptional time of a war against climate change, and that we want actually to reduce carbon supply, right? So, but what we find is that you have economic fluctuations are stabilized with price controls, but they only affect the dynamics of the system. So like the equilibrium is not, that is the one driving the environmental impact, is not reduced. So you actually need quantity controls. Rationing or like degrowth, you know, we would say. Or either you have degrowth or like rationing, or like a very vigorous change on the economic structure, you know, in the technological coefficients to reduce their environmental impact and increase the resource efficiency. So then in a way you can also stabilize prices while also reducing the environmental impact at the same time. And I'm just like going to show how like the stylized model like works with that. So first, like just small notes on the Bielefeld disequilibrium approach. Basically, just it defines multi-sector growth. You have like prices and quantities, and that's the only thing that you have. And then like the imbalances in prices, which are deviations of profitability, trigger a change in quantities according to the classical law of excess profitability. Like investment flows in when you have a positive deviation from profitability. And then also in like the classic raising law of excess demand, if you have an imbalance in supply and demand, not in quantities, then this will trigger a change in prices. These two dynamical laws are enough in order to have the classical gravitation around equilibrium that the new school is very fond of describing. But then the Keynesian effects instead that are price through oligopolistic market pricing and quantity, that is a demand line effect, they are stabilizing. Like they accelerate the stabilization and the convergence of the system to an equilibrium rest state, like as a point. Only with cross-dual, you only have oscillations. Yeah, just like keeping on going there, like this, I just had 2 slides with mathematics, so like please bear with me. I know that it's late, but here also like basically you define supply-demand imbalances and unit profitability imbalances. So here you have on your left, on equation 1, you have demand minus supply, and that's basically the imbalance. And here you have the intermediate production. Here you have investment, which is proportional to growth, and intermediate production. This is final consumption, and this is the supply. There should be an X quantity here multiplying the matrix C, which you can see that is defined here. And then profitability imbalance is basically the unit costs in intermediate goods. Then this is the profits. These are the wages or unit labor costs. And this is the unit revenue. And then like there should be a price here. Like I forgot to add, but this C matrix that is just an extension of the A matrix of input-output coefficients, basically is the one governing this complex structure of price-quantity interactions, like from one industry to all the other of the economy. And in equilibrium, you only have to set the imbalances to 0, and you can find, and this is going to be relevant in order to understand the reduction in environmental impact, like you have the equilibrium quantity vector, depends on consumption, and the equilibrium profitability vector, prices vector, depends on the unit labor costs. Yeah, and so on. Going further, and with these imbalances, then you can define the dynamical system. So what you can find is that the cross-dual effects are the classical Walrasian effects, where you have like the imbalance in prices triggers a change in quantities, and the imbalance in quantities, the Walrasian, triggers a change in prices. And you add also the Keynesian dual effects. So by just, it seems quite simple, but actually has a lot of equations. But this dynamical system governs the laws of motion of this multi-sector growth. And like this is simplified in a kind of matricial way, but this is the matrix of adjustment coefficients, and this is the matrix of the interactions, the structure of interactions. And you can compute from there, like the Jacobian, and if you are a fan of dynamical systems analysis, as I am, and maybe have some colleagues here then too, but basically like with the Jacobian, if the eigenvalues, the real part of the eigenvalues is positive, they are unstable, you have an unstable trajectory, and if they are negative, it's stable. If those eigenvalues are actually have imaginary parts, then you have the oscillations. So you can find that like some industries have like stable quantities, but oscillations in prices. Or you can find oscillations in quantities, or maybe there are no oscillations, only Keynesian effects prevail. And this depends on the intensity and the structure of these interactions. And now I'm going just switching to the empirics, like I hope that I'm going on time, but like that's the structure of A, the input-output coefficient. Like that's one of the nice things. It's nice to draw networks, but actually you can think of input-output tables as networks, where like there's like some hubs that are like extremely important. Like if you think, for example, of airports, like JFK Airport is really central. If there's any problem to JFK Airport, the whole network like collapses, of airport airplane traffic, and if there's just like a lost airport, I don't know, like in Alaska, and it collapses, maybe like it doesn't matter that much. So you can see, I don't know if you can see it from here, but Basically, on the bottom left, you have like in red, this is the agricultural sector. In green, you have manufacturing. That is also like one of the hubs. Then like in orange, that's like real estate, like finance, insurance, and so on. And then in the light green or the blue-green, sorry, I'm like a man, so I don't call colors as well, but like the management companies like services, essentially. But you can see, and like the size of the nodes depends on the size of the output. But like, of course, and you can see here, this is iron steel mills. And this is the a sector that is extremely central in the network of intermediate production. So of course, like you really want to operate over on that, like you want to decarbonize it, or maybe like you don't want it to be susceptible to input cost shocks because it will trickle into the reverberate into the rest of the economy. And all, like you can do that with all your economic networks of production, like all of them have this very similar structure. There's like a very few nodes that cater to the whole of the economy. So, and this creates a huge vulnerability to in the economy that you need like policymakers to take account for. So these are like the most central industries, and according to two different measures of network centrality. On the right, you have the eigenvector, like the eigenvector of the matrix, which is also like called eigencentrality, or the share in the standard commodity. And you can see that like in green, like manufacturing predominates. Iron and steel mills has an eigenvector value of 1. But then, for example, this purple one, sorry, no, this is wholesale, and this is electric power generation, this one. So and you also have truck transportation, in light blue, truck transportation, which makes sense. And also this is grain farming, and many other like nodes are also like involved in agriculture. And there was, I think, one. Okay, well, sorry. But like this already like explains like how like what are like these more like vulnerable sectors, and many of them are, petroleum refineries. Like it's like either like sectors that we have to be taken out also if you want to decarbonize. So like, and the fact that they are so central in the network shows like their relevance. And just like now, like moving into the intensity of these price quantity interactions, just to get a bit an idea of the dynamical behavior of the model. Basically, what you see here is a very synthetic, like cross-dual example for sense sector case of the US economy, where the input-output table is empirical, but they made up the adjustment coefficients. So basically you see this kind of turbulent gravitation around the equilibrium values that like the classical economists like to talk about. You have like this kind of growth and profit rate below. And when you try to plot that in a kind of in a two-dimensional plane where you put excess demand and excess unit profit on the x-axis and then the change in prices and quantities on the y-axis, you see, of course, linear slopes. And they're like so perfect and nice because I made up the adjustment coefficients and I didn't have to econometrically estimate them. When you try to do that with US BEA data, it's a mess, obviously, like it's really, really difficult. And I wonder, it's like, it's a problem with me, it's a problem with the data. And at the end, I came to understand that actually it's both a joint problem, So, and I use a Bayesian linear mixed model in order to try to compute like the general effect of each adjustment that is not industry specific, and then also the industry specific adjustment for each of like these interactions. You have like Walrasian on the top right, like quantity, which is like purely demand-led, Walrasian, classical, which is like where like price deviations create changes in investment, and price-price interactions. So like on the x-axis, you can see like supply-demand imbalance, profitability imbalance, and and it's just a linear regression. That's the only thing that you want to do. But so when I do like this Bayesian estimation problem, so then you have many different values that are consistent with the data and with themselves. And what we find here is that, for example, like the big effects that we see are like in the quantity, the Keynesian effect is really like important, but also the classical one. So like quantity-led effects, like as Keynes said, are like more relevant than the like price-driven ones. And to the point that, I mean, price-price interactions would be like evidence of oligopolistic markup pricing, like greedflation, that now it's being talked about. Actually, they are like, they cluster around zero. So I have, according to what I found, there's not that much evidence of oligopolistic markup pricing, but still price controls work, because price controls in this model work not on the oligopoly, on the market power, but work on the cross-dual oscillations. I'm going to show how. These are the industry-specific random effects. I mean, maybe it's too small for you guys to see, or too late for you to see, but you can just like pinpoint, because at the end, the effectiveness of each policy of like price controls or tax subsidy policies and so on depends on this intensity, like of these adjustment coefficients. So essentially, for example, I don't know, like with quantity effects, services is really big, finance, which is also quite big. So maybe it like suggests like speculation there, like when more derivatives generate more derivatives, and this kind of like Minskyite effect. And also manufacturing is also quite driven by quantity effects. And in terms of classical impact on the mobility of labor, of investment, like manufacturing is quite intense, so on. I also compare, like in red, it's the empirical findings, and in green, it's what I also, as I explained before with the eigenvalue discussion of the Jacobian, that some of these values, not all of them are stable. Like actually, like most of the dimensions are actually stable, but not all of them at the same time. So it's a bit quite, I have like 15 industries, and it's a bit like difficult to find like that stability. So, but the interesting effect that I would say on the difference between empirical and stable values is precisely on the price panel, because what you see is that while all the empirical values go around zero, the stable ones, green, are always a bit positive. So you actually, in order to have stable behavior, you need firms to have some degree of market power, in fact, like ironically enough. So here's that I have 3 minutes. So as I was saying, like once you have like the intensity and the structure calibrated, okay, you can have like simulations of this multi-sector growth model. And because you have it's ecologically extended, you can have all of these 2000 indicators, but what I chose is in the top left, energy usage, emissions in the middle, and then land use and water footprint. And for example, you can see that agriculture maybe has not that many emissions, but land use and water footprint is really important for agriculture. In terms of energy usage or emissions, utilities is obviously very important, transportation, and in light green, you have manufacturing, which also has a lot of land use. And then on the bottom left, you have prices and quantities in 15 industries. And once you have the model, you can, let's say, okay, let's simulate policies. Like, what do you want to simulate? So in this case, so we have agriculture shock. So you imagine that you have Ukraine war-driven oil grain embargo or a drought. Like Spain had a massive drought like this year that we had like basically no agricultural output. So you have a shock in 90% of the agricultural output on the bottom, on the left panel. Then you have a cap on price growth. And I just would urge you to look at the red trajectory here because it's the one that refers to agriculture. And you can see that the cap on price growth just decelerates the increase in prices. This is the baseline, and you have it here. It takes much more time and reaching like the same point as before. So you have like that the convergence to equilibrium is decelerated, but funnily enough, if you impose this cap on price growth, because price doesn't adjust as fast, then basically like the quantity here increases. You have like more agriculture output is produced as a response to the cap on price growth. So actually, it's good to have like a cap on price growth if you have a shock on agriculture on the quantity. And then a cap on price level, you don't have this deceleration to the convergence to equilibrium, but you, for example, are not acting on the quantity, like the system converges to equilibrium much faster. But if you want to truly reduce emissions, as you can see, like it's the equilibrium value that determines the level of environmental impact, you actually need rationing. You need to reduce consumption. So if you need 50% reduction in emissions, you need to reduce consumption by 50%. But this is quite untenable for most of the people like in the world, so like in the low income economies and also like low income households in the global north. So we need actually production to operate in the input output matrix by using tax subsidy mixes, and the tax subsidy mixes, and that's my last slide. So I have another one, but I don't have to show it. But like tax and subsidies function as levers that manipulate the profitability and growth differentials in your economy. So if you want, like you have, I don't know, like a sector that is cow-based milk and one that is oat-based milk, so you increase the taxes of the former and increase the subsidies of the latter in order to accelerate the technical substitution from the former to the latter. And this is a model also like made by Flaschel and Zemler that uses technical change, technical substitution. In this case, a one-off process where you can have here, these are quantities, these are emissions, and these are prices. So the baseline is no technical change. So that's what happens. And in order to compare, and then in this case, I include technical change, but without policy. You only have a more efficient technique that comes into play and competes with the old one. So you have like the green output takes a long time in order to overtake the red output or the dirty output. But if you include a tax, actually you go from here where there's the takeover to here. So you really accelerate a lot the carbonization. But what is the problem? That prices don't fall as much down. Like in order to have prices to fall down, you also need to include subsidies, because like this, you have a decarbonization that is even faster. As you can see here, emissions collapse much faster, but prices also go down. So you are also reducing energy costs, for example. These are utilities. Sorry, I forgot to say that this is substitution of utilities, of energy. And with that, and you can also compute that once you have the model, you can also compute it with a lot of different industries and check. I mean, this is on the x-axis, not here, but it's taxes. And you have like substitution speed, like the carbonization speed on the top, and then price growth rate on the bottom. And you see that without a subsidy, only taxes, only taxes, but lower cost of production. Yeah, you have like a reduction in the carbonization speed, like more taxes increase it, but prices also go up. And in what you need is subsidies that reduce the price growth is much lower, and the carbonization speed is much faster. So at the end, like the question is that, do climate accords induce climate change? The response would say, actually, yes, because the politicians, like there's no political will in order to impose a fiscal system, like enough taxes and enough subsidies and enough industrial action, industrial policy in order to truly decarbonize. Like I also compute the timescales of this transition, and I find that, yeah, like with proper taxation and proper subsidies, you can actually decarbonize in 10 years. It's not that difficult, but you need politicians to agree with, and they need to stand up to like big oil and the big, I don't know, agricultural companies, and that's difficult because planning is hard. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. So we are going to take one or two questions. So if you know you have any question, just let us know.
Could you go back to the first, I think it might have been the first simulation slide, but it was where you first introduced the policies. So you had rationing on one of them.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, there. What is the y axis of each of these?
What is the y-axis? Well, so with emission, I mean, you have the units first in emissions is the GG one. I mean, I don't know what is the unit refers to. And yeah, and like with prices and quantities, I mean, we're working with like relative prices and relative quantities, and it's a bit difficult. I mean, I didn't talk about the immense challenges in the econometric estimation because you need the series of prices and quantities, but they are given in indices. And sometimes you have to transform them in like absolute values. And yeah, I need a research assistant to help me with the unit question, but it's a very, yeah, relevant. But
Oh, it just looks very interesting that like quantity, if it's going from 40 to 20, it's either cutting in half or decreasing by a lot, but it doesn't look like the prices are adjusting by as much.
I would say that it's because it's relative, because at the end you're imposing that like consumption just decreases. So it's not, yeah, it's like demand led in that sense. So like like if consumption collapses by 50%, like emissions take place, but like prices do not need to be affected. I think, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, first of all. It was really insightful. I have two questions. The first one, again, probably about the figures, the units. When you go to the profit rates and growth rates, you had a diagram.
Oh, yeah.
Again, probably different normalization, but the profit rate goes from 1 to 2.2. Is it this 1 plus the rate of profit, or is just the rate of profit?
That's just like it's a sectoral rate of profit. I mean, this is a cross-dual toy model that I was like playing with, and that basically, yeah, you have like a normal profit rate and then oscillations of the profit rate around. You know, like when quantity is increasing, it's because profitability. I mean, you know the the deal.
And
But
other question, which is probably more a real question. You had the Sraffian standard commodity along with a weighted.
oh yeah, okay, yeah. So
how did you do that? Because that's amazing.
oh,
And
I mean,
the part is there some connection between the two? Because in some industries, looking like there is a connection. Can we have this connection?
Yeah, that's yeah, that's a very interesting question because yeah, I thought about it a lot because I mean, essentially, like the one on the left is the intermediate output, you know, like so it's like it's just like the column sum of the input-output table, you know, of all those coefficients. And it's a measure in network analysis, that's a measure of centrality that you can use. And also there's like some new Keynesian like work that says that actually that's the measure that matters, you know, like it's the output that you produce and you don't need the actual position within the network is not that relevant. With the other one, you are already using, it's a much more refined measure of centrality because it's this eigenvector one that it's the standard commodity. And when I just did some linear regressions, just like playing because I had a lot of free time. So, and you see it's very close, you know, like there's a very strong correlation. But yeah, it's interesting to actually like check the outliers. That's the interesting thing. And I think it's like services, for instance, are outliers. So like services are overrepresented as intermediate output and underrepresented in the standard commodity share, you know, as again in the eigenvector. And also, I think manufacturing has the opposite case. It's overrepresented. I mean, you can already see it a bit here with the last three nodes that is overrepresented as eigenvector, but not as the sum of the multipliers. And I mean, my guess is that it's a problem with evaluation of services, you know, like how you evaluate services, you have like finance there, you know, so I think that, I mean, yeah, other like real estate is reduced by half, services, yeah, like it's also very much lower. So yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting thing to explore more in depth because, but I'm only one person, so yeah, thank you for your question.
All right, last question.
Amazing presentation. Thank you a lot. I probably will ask just a general question. What do you think about effectiveness of carbon tax in developing countries, kind of Ukraine?
Mm.
You talked a lot about political will, like effectiveness of political adjustments and.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, that was like some like joint work with like Willie, like in my dissertation that actually like, I was trying to understand like are carbon pricing policies like taxation or like these probably the actual name like the emission trading schemes like enough in order to drive climate change, and that was why I mean that was from my other paper that I only use across dual dynamics. But basically, you see that yes, like carbon taxation really has an effect, but the problem is that when you have price effects, oligo market power, then like these pricing policies may not be internalized by the producer, but to the consumer. So what you were seeing, for example, in France, that like with the yellow vest protests, that they were saying, oh yeah, let's raise the taxes on diesel oil, but people were like suffering that because there's this pricing market power component. So that's why it's like I was saying that the intensity of the adjustment coefficients is really relevant. If they are zero, then you can actually use taxes, in this case, and you can really increase the carbonization. But here, I mean, like this x-axis, the tax rate, I mean, this is 25%. So this means like going, like to Shell or British Petroleum and say, okay, now a quarter of your output is going to go for like solar energy. Like it needs like, I mean, you were talking about like private entrepreneurs like driving this kind of like sustainability and reconstruction. I'm more critical of that. I would say that yes, like there's a war and there's also like a war against climate change. And in these exceptional times, you need planning, you need the state intervention, and you need subsidies, like massive investment in order to really do that. I mean, and with investment in 10 years, you can do it, like if properly done, like we were sending the men to the moon, like in the 60s, like it's not, it's not a technological problem, that would be a bit like one of the takeaways messages. It's a political problem, like when Evan was discussing that. Thank you for your question.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay.
Your last sentence presentation was 10 years we can bring this to zero emission.
We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
So in 10 years we can bring this.
We talk here.
Zero. Oh, in 10 years we can bring this to a zero emission. There is these problems always with delays in the dynamics. So, and I started working with differential delay system and so, and one of the things is you can bring the CO2 emission to zero, but the carbon budget up there is full. It's producing all the disasters for half a century after you've brought it to zero. And there's a huge delay in bringing down the weather extreme effects, even if you have controlled already the CO2 emission. And this happens with a lot of economic variables as well, so that there are some long one delay effects. Here's everything simultaneous, so to speak, in some sense. And that is an additional challenge. So anyway, just some remark, but it was a wonderful, great presentation, particularly having these two systems, prices and quantity move at the same time. So then you have to think about substance.
As having last word. That's right. Oh, yeah, you're the controller. Yeah, thank you for your comment.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Nice. So actually, like this is the work I'm currently working on it, and it's like almost 60% done. So I'm just working on a relationship between macroeconomic variables and CO2 emissions in Africa. And actually, I'm just looking at the top 3 production-based CO2 emissions in Africa. That is South Africa, Egypt, and Algeria. So let's look at the agenda for today. So I'll begin with the introduction, where I'll talk about the background, the objective, and also my contribution to this study. And the data part, I'll talk about the trend of the variables and also where the data were retrieved, and the method also I used for this study. And I will discuss the results, then finally conclude with policy recommendations. So basically, looking at the recent natural disaster that happened in Algeria, there was a wildfires due to changes in due to changes in temperature and also the speed of wind. And as a result of that, 34 people lost their life. And that is not the only recent climate disaster or natural disaster we have just witnessed. Let's look at my own country, Ghana, which is 2 months ago. There was also a flash flooding, where as at now, 26,000 people have been displaced. So now we know that climate change is real. It's not a joke. And therefore, you and I have something to do about it. There are a lot of factors that contribute to this mess. Let's look at the demand for energy. Globally, the demand for energy has increased drastically due to economic production and also rapid population growth. Energy is good for us, but it also has its own negative repercussion. For instance, the burning of fossil fuel energy, such as coal, oil, and gas. I mean, this fossil fuel also produce CO2 emission as the end product. And CO2 emission, you and I also know that it's one of the main drivers of climate change. So when we look at the global CO2 emission related to global CO2 emissions relate. Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. We can hear you.
Right. So the global CO2 emissions related to fossil fuel consumption and industry were about 36.3 gigatons in 2021. And Africa as a continent consumes or contributes 4%, which is the smallest. And if you compare what Africa alone contributes, and also with China, which is almost like 4 times. So we contribute less, but at the end, we are the most vulnerable region in the world. And there are a lot of reasons why that is the case, but this is not what I'm just looking at it. So in Africa alone, these 3 countries where I'm just working with, South Africa, Egypt, and Algeria, they contribute almost 60% of Africa's CO2 emission. And therefore, much attention has to be placed on these countries. So rising global CO2 emissions and their impact on the environment has made environmental pollution and economic relationship as a major topic in both developed and developing countries. For instance, Hanif Ita 2019 used ARDL method, and they estimate the relationship between CO2 emissions and macroeconomic variables among 16 Asian developing countries. And they found out that there's a positive relationship between fossil fuel consumption and CO2 emission. And similar study was also conducted by Pivu and Aminen 2014, where they also estimated the relationship between CO2 emissions and macroeconomic variables in 5 sub-Saharan African countries. And they concluded that FDI increases CO2 emission. So when you look at the existing literature on this subject, these 3 countries, Egypt, Algeria, and South Africa, are underrepresented. And that motivated me to study these countries. So the objective of this study is to examine the long run and the causal relationship between CO2 emission and macroeconomic variables in Africa. So my contribution to this study will be, to the best of my knowledge, that there has been no known study where they have examined CO2 emission and macroeconomic variables among these 3 countries. And also, when we look at the previous studies, most of them also failed to consider the issue of cross-sectional dependence. And at the end, I'm going to also provide policies which might be also very helpful in terms of CO2 emission reduction. So these are my variables I'm currently working on. So for the sake of time, I'll just talk about 2 of them. But first of all, I want to talk where the variables were retrieved and also how they are measured. So GDP per capita is measured in current US dollars. CO2 emission per capita is also measured in tons per capita. And renewable energy consumption per capita is also measured in kilowatt hours. Import here is import of crude oil and petroleum products. FDI is also measured in current US dollars. And energy intensity over here is also computed by the ratio of primary energy consumption to GDP. And oil consumption per capita as a proxy for fossil fuel is also measured in kilowatt hours. So looking at the colors over here, the orange color is for Egypt, and the green is for South Africa, and the blue is for Algeria. as I said earlier, I'm going to discuss about just two. Then at the end of my presentation, if you have any question regarding any of the graph, then I can also explain further. So let's look at renewable energy consumption per capita. And when we look at South Africa, we can see that the curve is increasing, and it's not surprising. But currently, Africa is the leading leader in terms of solar panel. They have invested a lot than any other African country. In 2016 alone, they set up about 1,329 megawatt solar panel. And when you go to Cape Town, which is also a city in South Africa, they have also doing a lot in terms of cleaner public transport, such as electric buses. So let's move to oil consumption per capita. And when you look at Egypt, you can see that the curve is decreasing from 2015 forward. In 2015, Egypt have also discovered gas at the moment currently, and so far it's the biggest gas discovered so far, according to their petroleum prime minister, Tariq. So now they are consuming more of gas than oil at the moment. That's why the curve is decreasing. So here I'm just trying to look at emission by sector, which sector contributes most in terms of CO2 emission. And when we look at all these three countries, you can see that electricity and heat is dominating. And for South Africa, they rely almost like 80% of electricity from coal. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so for South Africa, 87% of electricity come from coal. And we know coal emits more than any other fuel type. So we can see that for electricity and heat, the bar is very high than any other sector. And the same thing also applies to Egypt and Algeria. And from 1990 to 2022 for South Africa, there has been no changes as at now. But for Egypt, we can see that they are still increasing in terms of the electricity and heat. If you look at 1990 and 2020, I see the bar has increased more than other sector. So here, I'm also looking at CO2 emission by fuel type in terms of coal, oil, and gas. And for South Africa, it's not surprise because they rely more on coal than any other fuel type. And you can see the bar over here. And when we look at Egypt, 1990 and also 2021, there have been a different trend. Because initially, like they were also consuming more of what oil, and after discovery, and you can see that for gas, it has increased. So this is a method also I use for my analysis. So I started with data or variable transformation. Then I tested for panel unit test and co-integration test. Then fully modified ordinary least square for the long run relationship. Then vector error correction model for the causality test. And I will explain more when I move to subsequent slide. So based on the study conducted by Bekun et al. 2019, I estimated this log-log model. So here, I transformed the variables to logarithmic form in order to linearize the trend and also to solve the issue of heteroscedasticity. And here T indicates the years from 1990 to 2021. And I indicate the countries and E the stochastic term or the error term. Beta naught represent the intercept, beta 1 represent the partial slope. CO2 over here represents carbon dioxide emission per capita. GDP is GDP per capita. FDI is foreign direct investment net flows. REN is renewable energy consumption per capita. Intensity is the energy intensity. Force is the energy consumption per capita. Import is the import of crude oil and petroleum product. So due to globalization, trade, political or societal connection between countries, it could be that some countries also depend on one another. So to figure it out, I tested for cross-sectional dependence. And based on my results, these countries are independent. And cross-sectional dependence also help us to know what type of panel root tests to use. And since there's cross-sectional independent, in that case, I have to use first generation panel unit test for my unit test. So here, the results of the panel, first generation panel unit test shows that my series or my variables are stationary at difference. It means that they do not have trend, but at levels they have trend. Since the variables are stationary at different, therefore I have to test for the co-integration test whether the variables are moving together or they have a long-term relationship. And here I tested for Johansen test and also Kawo test as a robustness test. And here the results also show that the series are co-integrated, which means the variables move together or they have a long-term relationship. So regarding the long-run relationship, here I tested for both fully modified OLS and dynamic OLS. And fully modified OLS is a little bit different from dynamic OLS. And fully modified OLS is non-parametric estimation, while the other one is parametric estimation. And these methods are very, very popular, especially when it comes to this area. And they also solve the issue of serial correlation and also endogeneity issues. So when we look at the results over here, we can see that positive fuel has a highest coefficient over here, which has a positive relationship between CO2 emission. And the renewable energy over here is also negative, which means it decreases CO2 emission. And my results for the renewable energy also in line with Beku ITA 2019. And the fossil fuel results also in line with Abochi ITA 2019. So after this, then I tested for the causality test, whether this one causes the other or not. So here I use panel vector error correction model based on my results of the co-integration test. Since there was co-integration, therefore I have to use vector error correction model. So here the results also show that I'm just talking about the fossil fuel due to I'm just talking about one or two variables over here. So we can see fossil fuel or oil consumption per capita causes CO2 emission, which is a unidirectional causality, but not bidirectional causality. And this result is also in line with Pounds and Can 2021. And renewable energy over here also doesn't cause CO2 emission, which is also really good. So for the results, you can see that fossil fuel consumption or oil consumption per capita is the main driver of CO2 emission based on the coefficient over there. And also found out that there's a unidirectional causality running from fossil fuel to GDP, running from fossil fuel to CO2 emission per capita. So the policy over here, and look at these three countries, it's only South Africa where they have implemented carbon tax. And look at Algeria and Egypt, they don't have carbon tax. So in order to also to control this mess or to reduce CO2 emission, we can also include carbon tax in our policies and also trading scheme. And look at the investment in renewable energy among these three countries. For my evidence, it's only South Africa where they have invested a lot than these two countries. So if you want to see the impact of renewable energy on CO2 emission, therefore we have to invest more on renewable energy consumption. Thank you.
That's okay. That was a great presentation. I kind of have a little bit of a two-part question. I guess the first one is how much has urban sprawl been looked at in those countries in regards to contributing to their emissions? You know, because I saw like a lot of heat, well, electricity. I'm thinking they're cooling, and if they did it, you know, I just saying, like urban sprawl, how much has that been looked at? And number two, I saw the carbon tax. How politically do you think that would go down? I would be concerned.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I mean, Regarding the carbon tax, from the part I read, especially the Algeria Prime Minister is not a fan of carbon tax. He's just looking at the inflows. I mean, if you have like high carbon tax, it also discourages foreign investors to come into the country. So they don't support this carbon tax, even though they're also there to also to help in terms of CO2 emission. But they assume that there could be another way of, controlling this mess instead of just using carbon tax. And in Africa so far, what I have seen is only South Africa, which was set up in 2019. So it's not like everyone who is also in line with this carbon tax policy. And regarding the first question, could you repeat your first question again?
Have you guys looked at urban sprawl in regards to like controlling the sprawl of how like when you have like a metro area, and then because you have people who can't afford to live in the metro area, then they live out of the metro area, but they have to drive back in, and so then the area gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm not saying that everyone has to look like Manhattan, but is the urbanization in a sprawling manner that's not planned out? Do you think that that is impacting the emissions? Like, in regards to transportation, in regards to like heating the homes, because you have to, if you have sprawl, you have to take a like, pipe, and then you have to, send it out farther and farther, and that people have to drive, and then the groundwater. I'm thinking about California, and I'm just comparing it to.
Yeah, I mean, I got your point. I mean, it's about like industrialization, and mostly like in every country, especially the big city or states where they have most of the industrialized companies, and that's where they also produce what most of the CO2 emission. So they are also like, from my perspective, they are the ones like causing more CO2 emission than like the rural areas. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
Feridoon, yeah, can I ask my question to you concerning his presentation, or you can ask first. Why don't you do this? Ask your question.
Yeah, just curious that the bar chart you show of the energy sector emission for South Africa, we're completely, out of tune with the other two countries. Maybe for Algeria, sort of oil producing, but Egypt and South Africa, why is that sort of sharp difference? Is it because South Africa is growing much faster than Egypt, when that growth is basically fossil fuel induced, or what? Can you just explain a little bit?
You're talking about the CO2 per capita, right? CO2 per capita, that was his question, right? Hello, Ferdinand. Please, could you repeat your question?
Can you repeat your question?
Repeat the question?
Yeah.
Okay. That bar chart that you show of energy emission between Algeria, Egypt, and South Africa, yes, it's much larger for no, the other one, the one before that, much larger for the energy sector. Yeah, and I'm just wondering why it's so much larger for South Africa compared to Egypt. Both of them are non-oil producing countries. How do you explain that? Is it because the South African growth is, growing faster than Egypt? Is the growth sort of more fossil fuel induced, or what?
Yeah, and also for South Africa, they rely more on coal than any other fuel type. And we know like coal emits most than any other fuel type. And South Africa is also more industrialized country than these two countries. That's why the bar is too high.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Quick question. That don't have to answer this now, but you can give him good advice for the dissertation, and I got stuck there a little bit. For a time series analysis, the large number of tests. Look at the residual, whether or not your model fits well. Is a simple, very simple similar test for his methodology, cross-section panel discussion, that you can check the residuals as a test of how good the model fits. So because we saw it flipping around a lot, so to speak, the independent variable in their relevance. So are there exist for panel estimation also residual tests? But you don't have to answer now, but that would be a question later for his dissertation. Thanks. Think about this, and you can write him a note.
All right, so thank you, everyone. So we are moving on to the next session. So we are starting the next session. And the person who is supposed to start with us is Benas. Benas,
Yes.
around?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Sambler, for inviting. And of course, thank you to Ibrahim, Samuel, and Nick for organizing us. Could you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And it's full screen?
No, maybe you can, yeah, if you go, yes.
Okay. That's better. Okay, so today I want to speak about the energy transition and rare earth resource constraint market dynamics in an asymmetric duopoly model, which is a little bit different from previous discussions. And this is research that I developed in collaboration with Professor Giovanni Di Bartolomeo and Professor Willy Sembler. And in this stage is a working paper, so we are open to hear your comments and suggestions, and we appreciate that. About the rare earth elements production, here you can see in the graph the world mine productions of these elements, and it's for the 2 last years, but more or less it follows the same path for previous years also, and we can see China's monopoly in the rare earth elements production market. In the context of rare earth elements, we are particularly interested in the situation when when the China's monopoly in the REs market will finish, and we have a transition towards a duopoly between China and the rest of the world. For predicting this situation, we use the NMPC technique, nonlinear model predictive control, which help us to have a numerical solution and also consider policymakers' myopia, which later I will explain about that more. And in different sources, in different sources, they assume the gradual nature of this transition towards the duopoly. But in this study, we consider 3 phases. In the first scenario, we consider that China maintains a highly dominant position, and a duopoly can only achieve through public support for other country industries. In the next scenario, we examine the effect of technological improvements by the other countries, which significantly reduce their marginal cost. And we will assess this situation. And in the final scenario, we will assess the impact of public support. And we will see if we remove this public support, how would be the situation. The global focus on decarbonization through transitioning to green and renewable energies has resulted in a notable increase in demand of rare earth elements. There is an important point in this market that we should note, and that's the fact that China's dominance in the RE's market extends beyond just mining, and it includes both RE reserves and the entire supply chain. Because Chinese industries has flooded the global market with REs at subsidized prices. However, this current monopoly structure of RE market will likely undergo significant changes in the foreseeable future, as several important factors are driving this shift. For example, China's restricted export policy that we have observed recently will likely stimulate new suppliers to secure a reliable supply chain and mitigate the risk of future shortage. And we have some countries such as the United States, Japan, Australia, that they are taking some steps to reduce their dependence on China and try to enter the supply market. So for predicting this possible transition, we consider the potential duopoly game, and we examine the interaction between these two players, I mean China and the rest of the world, and we analyze their market share. As I mentioned before, we use the NMPC technique, and with using this technique, in each instant of the time, we can each players can predict the effect of the actions, their own actions, and those of their opponents on a finite moving horizon. And because generally policymakers operate under limited information or constrained information processing capacity, it might lead to imprecise responses, which commonly known as policy myopia. So using this method and this technique, we can incorporate different forecasting horizons, and with each value of this responding value, we can demonstrate a different level of policymakers' myopia. For the economic model, we used a duopoly game framework that considered both extraction activities and known reserve stock, drawing inspiration from the work of, as you can see here, Growth et al. 2003, and also we integrated some elements from the work of Greiner et al. 2012 and modified the reserve dynamic. The discovered RE reserve evolves according to equation 1, as you can see here, and it increases with a linear function of limited available resources and discovered resources, and decreases with the extraction of both countries. Also, we consider linear function for the supply, including the choke price. This choke price referring to the price above which demand for the resources will be zero. And later we will see that how we can use this for implementing the supporting policy. In the interaction between China and the rest of the world, both these players try to maximize their discounted profits. And in equation 3, you can see that how China maximizes its optimization problem subjected to the discovered reserves that I mentioned before. And as an incentive to extract, we keep marginal extraction cost for both players lower than the choke price. Also, the rest of the world has its optimization problem that you can see in the equation 4. It's again subjected to the same discovered reserve. However, you can see here in equation 4 that we added a subsidy parameter Z to support the production in the rest of the world. Considering China's long-standing dominance in the market with access to higher resources and infrastructure, we expect it to remain its leadership role in a duopoly market. However, this dominant position of the China would somehow incentivize support policy by the rest of the world to encourage new entrants in the duopoly market. In this study, we implemented this support through a higher choke price for the rest of the world. This is the supporting policy that we considered. So we have here the numerical solutions. We don't have time to look them in great detail, just to show like how it's estimated and what they explain. So in each figure, we have solid dash and dash dotted lines corresponding to high, medium, and low level of policymakers' myopia. In the first scenario, we consider a situation when China maintains its dominant position as long as its marginal extraction costs remain lower than that of the rest of the world. In the top, we have the stock of discovered reserve, and in the bottom, extractions. As you can see, policymaker with lower levels of myopia display more aggressive utilization of discovered reserve, while those with higher levels of myopia exhibit more conservative approaches. Also, we can see that policymakers with higher levels of myopia have a stronger inclination to maintain the current extraction level of China over the time. In contrast, they anticipate that the rest of the world will initiate its extraction at a lower level, and consequently, they expect that during the time it increase its extraction. For example, after period 2 or 5 for the medium or high myopic policymaker, they start to increase their extractions. However, with different levels of policymakers' myopia, we can see here from the result that rest of the world can maintain its presence in the market when there is a supporting policy, although it has a higher level of marginal cost. In the second scenario, we consider a situation when where there is a decrease in a marginal extraction cost for the rest of the world, for example, due to technological improvement. And in this scenario, interestingly, we observe that policymakers with higher levels of myopia tend to take actions that lead to a faster depletion of a stock of reserves. This is firstly maybe due to their belief that both China and rest of the world will continue their extraction at high level, at least for some periods. And regardless of time horizon, policymakers predict that the rest of the world will have a higher level of extraction compared to China. So as we can see here, this situation leads to an increase in rest of the world's market share, but the decline in the stock that we can see in the top graph limits this situation. And finally, we examine the impact of supporting policy on the market. And to simulate this situation, we remove the supporting policy, but still we keep the lower marginal cost, I mean the previous scenario. However, still China has its dominant position in the market. Here we can see that policymakers with different levels of myopia have the same prediction for extraction and reserves at the beginning of this duopoly situation. Also, interesting and important result is that it shows the absence of supporting policy negates the advantages of lower marginal cost for the rest of the world. So it completely highlights the importance and the effect of product pricing as a critical factor in maintaining in the market structure. So what are the main conclusions? Just finishing here. The results show that support policy, they have a great impact in the rest of the world's market share. And in the absence of this supporting policy, even if the rest of the world has the lower marginal cost, still it cannot keep a good share of the market, and it needs this support, this kind of support. So the result of our study emphasized that this transition is a long-term transition, and for going through this duopoly, we need to go forward cautiously, and we need to evaluate different supporting policy and consider the situation where both China and the rest of the world benefit from this situation. And that's it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are going to take one or two questions, then we move on to the next presenter. So any question?
Just make one remark. The constraints for the fast transition to renewable energy, decarbonization of the economy, and doing this in 10 years, the input side, the rare earth thing, that are also the important minerals that needed for this transition. And then we discovered that China has a complete monopoly on this. Yeah. So then we try to set up, so to speak, a game between rest of the world, or the US or Europe and other countries, and China as the main supplier there. And so this can be, there's a tricky game going on now to secure these rare earth elements for this transition. And not only there's the complication of this, what Oriol was presenting, but also it has huge price effects. You had this implicitly already in the models, so the prices could rise because of transition there. And this is basically trying to model this. So that's the intention of this, and so you can play with cost and prices and all kinds of things to see different scenarios. So I just wanted to explain this a little bit. It was a lot of technical things, but we had actually one story, but it shouldn't go out of this room. We had this paper in the top journal with China as a name in it on top. We got a rejection pretty quick with a mistake in the emails. One of the emails went to a Chinese ministry. The paper was rejected. It was funny, funny story. So we took the name China out of the title, and we are trying now a second time.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So our next presenter is Tato. Tato, can you hear me?
Yes, Sam, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, first of all, Professor Sambler, for giving me an opportunity to present my working progress today on the conspicuous consumption and on the endogenous evolution of preferences. I should warn you initially that this topic is not directly related to the topic of this workshop, but it's only indirectly correlated with this. So I apologize for this, but I think I will try to my best to make it as interesting as possible, considering this is kind of the end of the workshop. Okay, so you can see the slides, right?
Yeah.
Not. Great. So these are the major things which I want to discuss today. This is related to conspicuous consumption on consumption theory, and I will discuss different ways of classification of the agents and economic agents, and I will present the network theory, the model of the network theory, how we can model basically the conspicuous consumption through network theory. And then I will also present some simulations. And unfortunately, in terms of estimation strategy, we are a bit constrained because there is no data on the kind of connections between different consumers. But at least we can test the Weblenian idea of consumer on consumption patterns. And I also show you the new data which I obtained specifically for this project, and also which can be also useful for other kind of other purposes as well. First of all, the idea of course, idea of conspicuous of consumption is not new, and but to imagine kind of this kind of a thought experiment, imagine to kind of provoke the discussion on this topic. Imagine we are in the situation that the aliens come on the Earth, and they are interested on consumption patterns, and what they decide, first things they do is just they read the mainstream economics journals on the consumption theory. I warn you that if they do so, if they read the major journals, which I kind of try to follow, there will be a kind of zero. They will have a zero understanding on the real consumption patterns. So unfortunately, this is a kind of situation in the mainstream economic theory today. So for instance, the Samuel Bowles asks the important question that most economists have not asked: how we come to want and value things we do. This is kind of very Weblenian idea, and this is very important, especially in the era of social media. And I think this gains a new importance in the era of big data and social media. And I could pose this question in the following way: if Descartes, for instance, made this kind of statement that we cogito ergo sum, that we think therefore we exist, in the era of social media and the big data, we could ask the similar question, consume ergo sum, which would mean that we consume, therefore we exist. So without consumption in the 21st century, if we don't consume things, we kind of don't exist. And if, for instance, in the 18th century, English potter Josiah Wedgwood organized, just to give an example, organized the showrooms in London to kind of to invite a rich Englishmen there, and to force them to emulate and to kind of force them to induce them to consume specific goods. And now it's not any longer kind of you don't need to do this kind of stuff, because you can hire influencers in the 21st century, and you can kind of force and induce other people to consume the goods through influencers, through kind of demonstration, where influencers are paid to demonstrate things, and specifically to demonstrate consumptions of the specific goods. And this is kind of then creates different sort of consumption patterns. And I will skip some slides, and I will specifically concentrate on the kind of idea and the difference, just to remind you on the what kind of theory stands behind the alternative theory stands behind the consumption mainstream consumption theory. So this is an absence of static maximization of utility, and preferences are determined socially, and individuals emulate consumption patterns of those who are located on the higher hierarchy on income distribution ladder. And there are already some kind of research done on this direction. For instance, I will mention a few that disconnection of household consumption from household income, which kind of causes, which is caused by propensity of households to emulate contemporary standards of consumption established by others. So this is one important thing. Another thing is that the kind of tendency of conspicuous consumption creates specific tendencies with regards to productivity increase, with regards to hours worked increase, and also with regards to debt, household debt, household debts, household debt. The idea of conspicuous consumption is, of course, related to Veblen, but I also discovered in Marx that he also talks about this thing, and I brought this nice quote, which kind of summarized in the next slide, which is given in this way, and I will read this quote. Our wants and pleasures have their origin in society. We therefore measure them in relation to society. We do not measure them in relation to the objects which serve for their gratifications. Since they are of a social nature, they are of a relative nature. And he gives a metaphor of poor man and the rich man here, which I'm not going to discuss. But the idea is that, again, we kind of value things in term relatively in comparison to others. But the another thing which is important in terms of conspicuous consumption, and there is a debate regarding this, is it kind of a trickle down? Does it mean that we have a conspicuous consumption that only kind of lower income groups are emulating the higher income groups, or we may have a different dynamics? For instance, we may have the situation when working class kind of emulates, or middle class and working class then affects the consumption of upper class. So this kind of situation may also exist, and these kind of ideas we can find in the works of Bourdieu, and which I will show in a minute. So I mentioned that I wanted to present this through network theory, and already there are some works in this direction. And for instance, from Bamberg University, the two authors, they show that there are upward-looking consumption. They use the upward-looking consumption model at the micro level. And there are also some other works, including the empirical works, which kind of measures the network dynamics in terms of evaluating consumption patterns. And these some other works which I kind of give you to show you what kind of works already exist. And here is also, again, the problem of having the data on the network, so the connection between the different groups, and again, they use the proxy for kind of obtaining data on this. So my idea of kind of modeling consumption patterns in terms of network theory is the following. It's kind of based on the classical de Groot model, and I use a row stochastic matrix for modeling this. So imagine we have a matrix where each element of this matrix shows how much attention we, or kind of each element, pays to other person's consumption. So mathematically speaking, amount of attention I assigns to the consumption of J. So it will be a row stochastic matrix because it will be a kind of the weights in the rows, and then it will sum to 1, these weights. And you may ask for what we'll have on the as a diagonal elements. The diagonal elements will be kind of a learning rate. For instance, how much of this matrix, how much attention we pay to our consumption, right? To ourselves. And so this is what I just mentioned, that it will sum to 1. And there is no kind of, there are other models kind of social influence, kind of on the electoral votes, on the diffusion of ideas, but there is no model which would describe consumption patterns through row stochastic matrix, as far as I know. And I did research on this, and I couldn't find anything related to this. So to show it in terms of kind of picture, to make it easier to understand, imagine we have 4 different sort of agents. So, and they are interconnected. Then we will have this kind of situation that this weight, 0.2, for instance, and this is kind of a completely random number just for the demonstration, we have how much attention, it's kind of a learning rate. So because it's related to A's consumption, right? And here we see here that how much kind of attention A pays to B's consumption is 0.3, and how much attention B pays to A's consumption is 0.4. It's kind of illustration how, for instance, if we had 4 different agents, how would this kind of, in terms of the, here is a row stochastic matrix, and here in terms of kind of a distribution of weights as a picture or as a network. So again, using the de Groot model, we can estimate the consumption vector, and by including these weights here, and this will be a kind of dynamic process, like just a simple model, where it's again the vector in the starting point, in the point 0, and we have kind of weights here, and this is kind of number of iteration, and what kind of consumption level, it's again a vector of consumption, we'll have after t times t iterations, right? And depending, of course, on the structure of the matrix, of this weight matrix, we may have a convergence or cyclicity or like a periodicity in dynamics of this vector C. And so in terms of that kind of dynamics, again, a simple model how we can kind of demonstrate it. Again, these are the network. So we change in consumption in time. So we'll have how what kind of, we can interpret in terms of a distance. What is the distance between the consumption of I and consumption of J? And this coefficient can be interpreted in a different way. And one kind of way of interpreting this could be that it's kind of related to diffusion regimes. And I will explain briefly what these diffusion regimes may mean. We may have the situation where, for instance, in the times where diffusion process is faster, let's say 19th century, and to give us some kind of a specific thought experiment. In the 19th century, people didn't have any information, or their information, we can state in this way, their information was limited on what other people were consuming. But in the process of emergence of the media, like a TV and advertising, etc., we may have different regimes, and the information on consumption of different people may spread in different speeds. So if we compare like a 19th century information diffusion with the 21st century information diffusion, specifically on consumption, it's kind of, it will be a really different speed of diffusion, right? So we can, this coefficient may be time dependent. Okay, now the another thing which I want to mention is how we can classify different agents. For instance, I showed the different 4 different agents, right? And in the Veblenian sense, they differ only in terms of their income, right? But there is a nice idea which I found in Bourdieu's distinctions, and then further investigated by different authors and interpreted. And I found this diagram in Rosengren, and I think, and I wanted to explain you and how it can help us to determine different weights. So Bourdieu provides basically a simplified version of Bourdieu kind of two different axes. One is economic capital, and the another is a cultural capital. So we basically have 4 different sort of agents. So person, let's say agent A or person or consumer A. So what kind of consumer A is? A is a person who has a high economic capital, is a rich person relatively, and has a high cultural capital, which means as a proxy, we may use, for instance, the education, the upbringing, right, etc. So this will be people who creates, for instance, fashion, who are kind of on the higher income level, higher ladder of income distribution. And we could say that these people are paying less attention what other people are consuming. So if we kind of think in terms of the weight matrix, we would say that these people are paying like they will have a higher learning rate, right? So they pay the attention on only their own consumption. And here we have another type of person who has high economic capital but low cultural capital. These are people who are kind of new businessmen who recently kind of became a rich, but they don't have enough education. So we would say that these people, kind of, we hypothesize in this way that these people would have a kind of will be more vulnerable to Veblen effect. So they will pay higher attention specifically what other people, like let's say A, consumes, because of they have a lower cultural capital. And then we have a person, this I would say, who has high cultural capital and low economic capital. These are the people and consumers like us, like academics, who I would say in the weight matrix will have for JS consumption for other kind of they will have they will pay lower attention to what other people consume, right? And then we would have people with lower cultural capital and lower economic capital, and these are the working class with a lower level of education. Of course, this kind of a static picture here, but this and this can change. People move from one group to another, and then what I did, use this idea and simulated. Basically, these are the description which I just described, so I will skip it, and then this kind of a basis for my further work, which I am planning to build the agent-based model on these ideas. But this kind of shows us kind of simple simulations when we have different rate of diffusion, different rates of diffusion. So how like how fast the convergence happens, and a slower the is a diffusion constant, then we'll have a lower convergence rate. It means that of course, it's a simple model. We don't have income constraint, etc. But it's kind of it's given as a simulation, a sort of experiment. Okay. So I have also diffusion process and consumption networks, and consider. Sorry.
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. Yes. Thank you. Then I will skip some graphs, but I just will mention that these are the different simulations for different different weights, different diffusion rates specifically, and we'll have different clustering considering different diffusion rates. Now, I will want to talk a little bit about the data which I obtained and which I constructed. It's not easily available, so I need some work to do. While it does not help us to evaluate these network effects in terms of connection between different people, but it helps us to model the Veblen effect itself. And let me show this. So what is the structure of the data? So what I compiled is, this is just a fraction of this. It's like a really huge data set. It contains 23 different goods for different income groups, 5 different income groups. And and then I classify different goods. For instance, one way of classification is this following: if the income is increasing, when income is increasing, or if the share of consumption is decreasing or increasing. Actually, I built the dashboard, and I want to show you because I think it will demonstrate in a better way. Specifically, this first visualization, which is one dashboard, just to give you a flavor of what kind of data I have. This is for instance, is alcoholic beverages for 5 different income groups. Just to show you, I built the shiny dashboard for demonstrating it, but it's like a 23 different goods, and there is also like, as I mentioned, 5 different income groups. Okay, and these are all other goods which I have here. And another thing in terms of classification, which I think is important, which I want to show here. Okay. In terms of classification, this is important. So I mentioned, for instance, if we choose vehicles by income quantiles, we see that as income is increasing, the share of consumption expenditure on vehicles is increasing. Like we have some slight exception here for this group and highest group, but I still consider that it's a kind of a luxury. So I qualify it and I classify it as a luxury good. If we choose, for instance, different good, like let's say tobacco, then we have different dynamics here, different shares, I would say. We see that as income is increasing, the consumption of tobacco is decreasing. And so I use this method for classification, or for the classification of different goods, whether it's a luxury, whether it's indeterminate, or this is a necessity. So the one thing in terms of the analysis, basic analysis, which I wanted to show is the following. When I obtained these shares, you'll see that, maybe I should zoom it, lowest 20% of income quantile here, and these are basic correlation analysis. We see that as the correlation between like a lowest percent income quantile is higher for the second percent income quantile, and then it decreases. So it's kind of the Veblen's idea that this lowest percent income quantile is kind of emulating the upper quantile. So it's a hierarchical kind of situation. We got the hierarchical situation here. And the same applies to other groups. And these kind of diagonal elements are, of course, the correlation with itself. And the same applies to other quantiles. But I will not stop here. And then what I did actually the kind of causality analysis. One way of causality analysis, which I did, was a Granger causality. Then another thing is a transfer entropy method. But I have only the Granger causality here because I wasn't able to put it on the slides because of lack of time. But yeah, I got the similar results. So what I did here, I estimated Granger causality for the vehicle consumption, which I considered, as I mentioned, as a luxury. And we see here for the lowest income quantile and see that basically like all of them, second, third, fourth quantiles are Granger causing the lowest kind of consumption expenditure of lowest income quantile. And there is a p-value slightly higher for the highest income quantile. And another thing is I estimated for all the quantiles and for all the goods, but I show as an example only some of them. And we see that here, for instance, for the second income quantile, the lowest does not Granger causes kind of a consumption expenditure of the second income quantile on the vehicles. And here we see also that, let's say, highest income quantile Granger causes. So there is some information flow on from the highest to second. So the interesting thing is that in terms of the direction of causality is the fact that for the highest income quantile, there is the very kind of high p-value, so there is no causality, direction of causality for the highest income quantiles. But we see that for the lowest income quantile, Granger causes highest income quantile. So it may be related to this idea of and the criticism that, and also direction of the causality, which I mentioned before, the idea that there are some situations when highest income groups are emulating the lowest income groups, like a working class, very rich are emulating the working class. As a criticism, some people bring the idea of genes, and that which the good, which was kind of very popular among poor, then became very popular among rich, and then it became like a popular in all society. And for the goods which are considered as a necessity, I also conducted kind of causality tests, both using a Granger causality and also transfer entropy. And specifically, I should mention that when I ran this VAR model, I found out that for the goods which are considered as necessity, the coefficients are not expected ones. Sometimes we got negative and they are not statistically significant, etc. And basically, this can be kind of attributed to the fact that we don't have kind of the Veblen effects when we have like a goods which are kind of are in the group of necessity.
I think your time is
I'm
up.
finished. Oh, yes. And the final thing which I want to mention, I wanted to use time evolving correlation. And for instance, I wanted to estimate, and this is my next plan, to estimate how social media affects consumption expenditure of different groups for the specific groups. For instance, if after the introduction of social media, we may think that there is a higher rate and higher speed of information diffusion, so we see better what the other people are consuming. And my hypothesis is that they will have different regimes for this. And one way of testing this was using the wavelet function and time evolving correlation. And so this red kind of like a heat, like which became darker, becomes darker at a higher rate of correlation. And where is no data, there is no statistically significant correlations for this period, for instance. And there I estimated for the vehicles for low and second. So we see that after 2008, there is a higher rate of correlation. Is it related to social media? I don't know. Maybe it's not, and it's completely spurious. So we need a different estimation procedures and to isolate the process. But I also found for the second and third, for all of them, for the vehicles, I see that like after specific after 2007, 2008, and sometimes before, specifically when social media level is really high, there is increasing level of correlation between the consumption of vehicle by second and third income quantiles and etc. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and I think I don't have a time to summarize, but what I will mention is that there is a huge room for exploring this idea of conspicuous consumption through network theory, and especially I think it's important in the era of social media. And yeah, thank you. And I will be happy to give some thoughts on conclusions maybe during the Q&A.
Right. Thank you so much for your presentation. So we are going to take one or two questions, then move on to the last person.
Let me just do one or two remarks. Maybe Veblen was a founder of the New School with his behavioral view of how the economy is working. And so I think this is a good quantification now what's actually you could have meant. And so this is the conspicuous consumption theory there. So I put him on this path to explore this with the network theory and create the results. The second point is that one can now apply this to the preferences of carbon and less carbon intensive goods. And there's a lot of preference shifts going on the market now. But nobody has done a model where the diffusion is shown of these preferences, so that more and more or less carbon goods are occurring. So that's also an implication that basically shows the diffusion of this. It's not that far yet with the carbon intensive, less carbon intensive goods. But my last remark is I fear I will lose a very talented student to the advertising market. With all your new results, you will be hired soon in the advertising industry. Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. So now we move on to the last person. Ibrahim, are you there?
Yes, I am there, and well, I'm glad I am the last one because my presentation is probably the least interesting. So I won't spend too much time then, and then you're free to enjoy the rest of the weekend. So let me share my slides and tell me if you can see. Right?
See you.
Now, try something. No, it's probably. So Do you see, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it's a work in progress, and basically the topic of my research is about the role of public capital, or in the specific case, public infrastructure, and how delays in completing those infrastructure can affect green transition. So, sorry. So I'll start quickly by the motive. A little just warning here that since it's a work in progress, it's mostly, for now, it's mostly analytical, and I will mostly focus on the motivation, so that you get the idea here, and then I'll go briefly over the model and then some of the analytical results. So I go here with the idea that infrastructure investment is key to hastening the transition to a green economy. And some of you already mentioned that the Inflation Reduction Act in the presentation, and for instance, the US Inflation Reduction Act calls for major investment in infrastructure. For instance, modernizing the energy grid, the upgrading of buildings to be more energy efficient, a public transportation expansion, also investments in research and technology, research and development in new technologies, etc. But there is a problem. There is a critical challenge here with infrastructure projects, which is the uncertainty with regards to their implementation. So when a project is approved, public spending takes place, basically takes place continuously over time, but it's only relevant for the private sector or for private production only when the project is completed. So you can only make use or benefit from the infrastructure only once it is finished, right? So, but if infrastructure project completion dates are uncertain and subject to delays or unforeseen delays, private resource allocation decision may be critically impacted. So and with it, the green transition. So delays in project implementation can lead to a significant increase in cost as well. So not only you have a delay, but you have also an increase in cost. So then you have an additional drain on scarce national resources or the government budget. So here, basically, there has been already a lot of work on the quantitative significance of public investments for economic growth. And we can mention here Aaron Kurz, Ashauer, and Barrow, and many others. I just mentioned some of the most important papers. And a standard assumption with this literature is that public investments instantly adds to the stock of public capital, so that every unit of GDP spent on infrastructure increases its stock in the same period. So that's basically the assumption in this literature or in the standard models. So there is no real implementation lags in these models, but in reality, as probably most of you know, that implementation and completion of public infrastructure is frequently subject to unanticipated delays and cost overruns. Well, here, just to give you a simple example, I'm sure you already heard of some of the famous projects that took way longer than expected. For instance, we have the Big Dig in Boston, and I think it took more than 8 years actually. I think it took more than 8 years, and the cost overruns reached almost 477%. And you have also like the Berlin airport, which is also a famous case, and other projects. So here, the reason I'm talking about this is when you have to think about this, for me I consider these delays an important subject for research, is mostly because we are targeting by mid century an economy with net zero carbon emissions. So, and if we have this, if we take into account these delays, we might exceed the years, or exceed the deadline for reaching this project. So, what do you think? I mean, this is a question probably for Oriol, because he said that it will only in 10 years, if there is a will, they can do a green transition. So this is some of the obstacles we have to deal with. So and another thing why I focused on public capital is because there is a complementary relationship between private investments and public infrastructure. And here, by the way, it gives you an idea of what model I'm using here. So the complementary relationship between private investment and public infrastructure in the production function. So these delays generate uncertainty for private allocation decisions. But the problem is that the private investment responds to this stochastic and infrequent arrival of public infrastructure goods. This is how I model the delays in public infrastructure. Is not really clear, because there are two effects that can take place. So you have what we call the intertemporal substitution effect and the precautionary saving motives. So the intertemporal substitution effect is basically when the delay of resource allocation to private investments, since productivity benefits of an infrastructure project can only be realized after it has been implemented. And also, uncertainty induces desire to substitute future private consumption with current consumption to avoid consumption risk in the future. And then you have the other effect, which is the precautionary saving motives. So to maintain the flow of output, private agent might choose to increase private investment. So you have two conflicting effects here, and then of course that depends on the data used for the model. So in addition to this, when you're considering, for instance, in the transition context, when you consider two private sectors, for instance, a dirty and a green sector, there are two additional implications. First is on equilibrium. What are the resource allocation between the different productive sectors, as well as what is the impact of these delays on the equilibrium asset pricing of these risky sectors or risky assets. So there are two main objectives in this paper. So basically, the first one is to look into the overall impact of public investment delays on private investment decisions. And the second one is to look at the resource reallocation between two risky illiquid assets or sectors. Sorry. So here I give you a brief introduction of the model. Here I consider an economy in continuous time with infinite horizon. Why a continuous time? Because with continuous time you have also the ability to a certain extent to get some analytical solutions. So to give you an idea what's going on. So in this model I consider two representative sectors. I call them G and D, basically green and dirty. And the production function of each sector is, I use the classical Cobb-Douglas function here, with A being the total factor of productivity. The Kn here is the private capital, and Km is the stock of public capital, which is accumulated through government spending. And of course, alpha here is the output of output elasticities of capital. And the aggregate output in the economy is the output of the dirty plus the output of the green sector. And the economy's aggregate constraint is given by, of course, by the following equation, where basically aggregate consumption is equal to aggregate output minus private investments, both in green and dirty, minus the investments in public sector. And a simplifying assumption here in this model is that the rate of public investment is assumed to be proportional to aggregate output. So that we have this IM equal basically, sorry for the typo here. It's not capital M, is I capital M, and it's equal to M times Y, the Y being the aggregate output. For the representative consumer, I assume a recursive utility. Basically, she has a homothetic preference, featuring both constant relative risk aversion and constant elasticity of substitution. The reason I'm using I'm using a recursive utility is because it allows us to disentangle the agent's risk aversion from her elasticity of intertemporal substitution. This is important since this concept captures different phenomena. First, risk aversion determines how much an agent invests in risky assets, or in this case, risky sectors. And the elasticity of intertemporal substitutions is decisive for how the agent distributes her consumption over time. So this is basically, again, the standard textbook recursive utility function. So and here I show basically the different law of motions that is part of that represent the different law of motion of capital, both the private capital and the public capital. And here they are represented as jump diffusion process. This is for the private capital, the dirty and the green. They are both represented as diffusion jump processes. As for the public capital, it is only subject, there is no diffusion, but it's subject to jump, which represent basically this fraction of investment that is not certain that will be transformed into capital. So that's basically how delays is represented in this model. Just for a simple illustration here, what do I mean by jump diffusion process? This is, you can think of it as a single path here. You can have different paths, but what I'm showing here is that diffusion is basically what gives us these small oscillations, and the jump is when you have a shock, for instance, any say financial crisis or anything that affect the economy, for instance, and hence the capital. You have a straight or a strong decrease in the value of capital. So and this is what basically what I mean by jump diffusion. So as I said, private capital is subject to uncertainty from the sector, and this capital, as I said, the capital flow is modeled as a diffusion process. but also I forgot to mention here, is also by a jump process to represent catastrophes like, say, an economic crisis or a climate crisis as well. Another thing is that private capital is not fully liquid. There are adjustment costs. This is standard macroeconomy model. So the installation of new capital incurs cost, and we take from Hayashi the quadratic form. And the stochastic, as I said, as I showed you above, the stochastic arrival of public capital goods is modeled in the form of a Poisson process. So to make things clear and also simple, is that we define two state variables. What does this state variable means? That basically we have the share of dirty capital over total private capital. So this is one state variable. Another state variable is the ratio of public capital over total private capital. Again, K is private capital. And private capital here is the sum of dirty and green capital. So there is just here one remark. From this, we assume that the capital here, the two sectors are perfect substitutes. But it's also possible to generalize the model into imperfect substitutes, but can only be done numerically. So from there, of course, then from the aggregate consumption we showed above in equation 3 or 2, if I divide by equation 2, yes, if I divide everything by private capital, then I obtain the following equation. So, so this is basically an illustration of quickly of the model in hand, and of course, basically it's an optimal control model in continuous time under uncertainty. So, and you can solve the model basically using dynamic programming. Now, let me go quickly to some of the implications here. So what happens to the equilibrium risk-free rate? So what we see here is that we derive from the above setting. Of course, I jumped some of the steps here, but first I need to derive the state price deflator, or the stochastic discount factor, and from there I get the risk-free rate. And what you see here below, or I mean in front of you, is basically the risk-free rate taking into account the different sources of risk. So here the diffusion risk, and then you have the jump risk here, for instance, due to an economic catastrophe or crisis, and then also here the risk from the delays, from the implementation of the public infrastructure. So what it says here is that so to make it clear, I put the minuses here. So the risk-free rate is lower due to different source of risk. So intuitively, what does it mean is that the risk-free asset becomes more attractive to risk-averse investors, as it ensures a decent standard of living even in the disaster state. Now, what happens also to the value of capital? So we can derive the value of the dividend yield in each sector, and basically what we get this following equation that is both a function of the dividend, but also the Tobin's cube. And what we can see here, the one I put it in blue here, represent the share, as I defined above, the share of public capital to private capital. And then since we know that the public capital is subject to delays risk, so then it affects also the dividend yield. So the rate of return from investing in a private sector here in sector N is also subject to these delays, which in a way affect the beta of this sector, since the beta is the covariance of the return of the sector with the market return over the variance of the market return. So basically, that's the what I'm trying to show in this paper is basically the risks or the asset pricing implications of public investment delays on the private sector, and this has, of course, which is also we are intending to extend the paper to include the social cost of carbon, and in that case, what happens is basically, and if I may, sorry, to go back to the production function. So in that case, we will have to add another capital utilization. Another factor of production, which is fossil fuel use, and from there we can also derive the social cost of carbon, which will help us determine the optimal carbon price. But then again, the question is, of course, is to know if the delays will have an impact on this social cost of carbon, and what will it be? Will it increase or decrease the social cost of carbon? And in case it increases the social cost of carbon, do the firms? Why have the firms have to pay for the delays that are caused by the government? So this is the type of questions we're trying to answer in this paper. So I think I'll stop here, and I think I've spent 15 minutes or so giving you an idea of what this is paper about. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much also. I think we are going to take 1 or 2 questions, then we close for today. Any question?
This is a quite elaborate model now that you are working on, got good results. But there's a very simple story in New York here to explain the delay and the multiple of costs that are arising in these infrastructure projects. And this is a famous story about the main enterprise. His name is Moses from New York. He said, well, it's very simple. Because if I go to negotiate with the state, I have to compete with other competitors, and I underprice this. Secondly, and I promise to be paid to get this construction early. Second, he says, well, once the state has started this construction, it can never back out of this anymore. So then price is the multiple price of this and takes a very long time. It's actually this guy who infrastructure construction in New York City. So,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, you have this. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So you have this. Of course, this issue where the contractor tries to get as much money out of the government pockets as possible, but also there are sometimes most of the cases is that there is bad planning, and the reason is there is no deep study of the potential technical difficulties, sometimes just simple technical difficulties that can come in the future. And this is like one. It can be also the problem. It can be because it is a problem with multifaceted sources. So another source of delays could be just that election of a new government. The new government just have other priorities and then just reduce the financing of these projects. But of course, here we are dealing with green infrastructure, and it is of utmost importance. And hopefully, that I know that elections are coming soon, at least in the U.S., and then I hope there will be no impact on this infrastructure project that has been initiated under the Biden administration, because 2050 is not very far away after all, if we take into account the time it takes to build this infrastructure.
Probably not happen under Trump. So, yeah, but a very good model. As it's very, very sophisticated and very good. But this story about the infrastructure in New York, it's a very interesting. I heard this if 2-3 weeks ago. Why there was such a delay? And it's Berlin Airport. It's incredible, the delay and the multiple of cost estimates of the original cost there. So, and yes, for the green infrastructure, this is a problem. Yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act. What's promised there? Yeah.
Yeah, and then but the time of planning and the time of construction takes a lot of time. So private investors are actually just waiting until they are sure if the infrastructure will take place or not. Then they can invest, and that is what I was trying to show here, is that this complementarity can be a problem actually, because they can. I mean, of course, there are probably ways to have public-private partnerships in building this infrastructure, but overall, if you want to, you can only invest in further green projects once the infrastructure is done. If it is not done, you cannot. You will not, because then what's the point? So
more than 10 years.
I completely agree. I mean, like something that when we really like raise this point, I mean, like something that I felt to disclose is that like the model that I work on is linear production. Like you don't have fixed investment, but of course, I mean, when we're discussing like infrastructure, it's all about the fixed investment. I mean, like I just work with like circulating goods, you know. So of course, like I can get only 10 years. Like one of the interesting things of trying to expand my model is to try to include also investment, but that's a bit difficult. Thank you. I agree.
And also with respect to investment and ordering and installation of investment, Kalecki is the most important guy there. He says he has his differential delay equations where you have a huge delay between your investment decision and the actual implementation. That's so. But anyway, very, very interesting projects. You want to say last word, or?
If someone has any question from the online audience, only 4 people.
Georgia, or from Berlin, or from you are sitting in New York. Feridoon. Any other questions? No. Well, I think then we are very happy to have a great day here with all the new innovations in thinking about the long way of this transition period that we probably still have before us. And I just wanted to say, if anybody in the meantime, I do every semester, every year, these research workshop. If anybody has an idea, so what should be the topic and some topic or main topic of the next research workshop, just send me an email, also we can collect some ideas. But that would be a good help for organizing the next one, so probably next year in the fall or so. Otherwise, I would thank you all for contributing without pay. You see, and even without much cost or without travel cost. Nowadays we can do it. So thank you all for the presentation here and all for coming. And then anybody else want to add something? No? All right. Then I wish you a
Good night.
Good night.
Yeah, I want to add good night.
Thank you.
Thanks for a good day, and let's get out of here.
Okay. All right. Thank you for everybody for coming and doing this job here. Yeah. Okay.